An upcoming wedding shower for Callie Huey, bride-elect of Eric Ragsdale. That's this Sunday, 2 to 4 p.m. at the home of Carol Reese. Celebrate Recovery is having their 6th anniversary. If you enjoy Celebrate Recovery, even if you haven't done that, it'd be great to be there for the 6th anniversary this Friday, 6 p.m. right here in the chapel. Red, white, and blue packing this Saturday. Details on a Honduras fundraiser that you can buy racks of smoked baby back pork ribs, other things, and so I'm going to leave that here. A car wash fundraiser coming up with the Deaf Church, LTC weekend coming, office closed on Good Friday, so I'm going to leave that here, and if you'd like to check details, please do, and we will begin our class this evening. I've done some rewriting concerning the order in which we're going to do things in this class. I thought it might be helpful to you just briefly for us to think about where we're going. It might be of interest to you. And basically, having spent, ended up being all of March because of the workshop, dealing with some church history issues and Reformation history and the introduction to Restoration history. We began last week to think about religion on the frontier, especially introducing some ideas about Barton Stone. Today we're going to continue our study of Stone and hopefully conclude that study. And then we're going to spend some weeks, a couple, maybe into a third week, but a couple at least, with Alexander Campbell, thinking about various aspects of his history, going back to the European continent briefly again, to think about some restoration efforts that preceded the Campbells. We're going to then think about our question, our ultimate question, and that is, what's the future? As we think about what's happened, that'll be on the 30th, highlights of some continuing parts of the story. Then we're going to think about where we go from here. What does it all mean? What's the future of this whole concept of restoration? We're going to, as a part of the review and kind of thinking through this, we're going to spend a couple of weeks dealing with a video entitled Wrestling with God. It's the story of Alexander Campbell, but it also goes through a lot of the things we've talked about restoration history. I think it'll be a wonderful review. It'll be enjoyable. It's well acted. And then the last week of our class, I'll be back from Peru, and this won't be a video, but we're just going to have a general discussion, that last 45-minute class, to think about that question that continually comes up and maybe plagues us, or at least, and sometimes troubles us, but at least concerns us, and that is, where do we go from here? And what does it mean to be involved in the restoration? So that's the story that we're going to be dealing with, and that's how we're going to be dealing with it. When we come to Stone, some of this is a brief review. We're thinking about a man who seized the moment during a time of revivalism in our country. Sometimes he's referred to as apocalyptic. He did have a great focus on the end times, but his focus was toward piety. His focus was toward a way of life. The old original Cane Ridge structure exists, but it exists inside a new construction. And so this is the building that was built around the original structure, the wood structure. This is, of course, a stone structure to protect it. And there's a hallway all the way around the old original structure, probably 10 or 12 feet wide. So this building is probably about 20 or 25 feet wider and 20 or 25 feet longer.
They built it out of stone in honor of Barton.
In honor of Barton Warren Stone. Good observation. Revivalism was very much a part of the experience of the American frontier in the early 19th century, what we often know as the Second Great Awakening. We are going to be reminded briefly of some of the conflicts that were going on among the Presbyterians. They were suffering a number of casualties. Groups were leaving them. The Campbells were not the first. Stone and some of his friends had left previously. with the Springfield Presbytery, the Cumberland Presbyterians. There were other things happening among the Presbyterians, and there were a lot of converging interests. So we'll not spend a lot of time going through this detail again, but the revivals are important, the revivalism of the early 19th century, because it represented a challenge to Calvinism. Because the whole idea that you wait for God was being replaced with motivational preaching. And there was a focus upon preaching, and there was also a revolt of a type against increasing controls from above, within hierarchies, within the churches. Stone was born in 1772, early, 10 years approximately after Thomas Campbell, but 15 years before Alexander Campbell. He was born prior to the Revolutionary War. His father died early. He remembered spending time with General Cornwallis. He remembered other details of the Revolutionary War, and eventually went to school. He went to school to study linguistics. That was kind of what you did, the literature, the linguistics, the languages. Schools were not at that time considered preparatory. He went to school even though he had thought about becoming a preacher because he had experienced some of the revivalism. But the revivalism, in his experience, very quickly wore off. He'd be excited at the revival, and then he wasn't so excited again. And so as we look at that, let me get the one that's in the middle here. He heard that preaching. He heard the kinds of sermons that were being preached, and he was thinking about what that meant for him, and was eventually converted. What we have in that, especially with the preaching of James McGready, was a focus upon how God would work among His people, so that you have the sovereignty of God, plus you have a human response. And of course, that's a change from Calvinism. So revivalism was no longer something done only by God where people waited. Stone heard that preaching, and Robert Richardson in his memoirs talked about how that Stone eventually retired to the wood and with his Bible found his relationship with God. But it was a struggle for him. I guess all of that is to say that Stone is not your typical hero. Stone, at least in the development of his spiritual life in the early days of his life, is not what you would expect. He did not enter this whole enterprise with the idea that I'm going to be a revivalist, or I'm going to be a reformer, or I'm going to be a restorationist. But he did feel a great desire to preach, but was concerned because thinking about religion in that time did not have what he called a divine call, had not experienced that. So having completed the school that he did with Caldwell, he went to a school that was being run by a Methodist preacher named Hope Hall. He taught linguistics there, but he still wanted to preach, and he was encouraged in that by David Caldwell, and he decided that he would apply to be a candidate for ordination with the Orange Presbytery. But in order to do that, he simply had to receive his papers to have permission to preach. So there was a preliminary period, there was a testing period before the ordination actually occurred. Stone's mother was a Methodist, as we've mentioned. She wanted him to become a Methodist preacher. So there were a lot of various forces that were pulling on Stone from a lot of different directions. Well, after having received his privilege or permission to preach, he went to Fort Nashboro, to Nashville, what we would know as Nashville. And while he was there, he met a man named John Anderson, who told him that a man named Robert Findlay was leaving the church in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. This would be basically a Presbyterian church that had already been established. And so Stone went there and he preached with great success, not only at Cane Ridge, but went on a preaching tour. In fact, he was so successful that they asked him to stay. And so by late in 1796, Stone was in Bourbon County, Kentucky at Cane Ridge and had opened a school and was beginning to train 10 or 12 students. And we mentioned some of those, I think, in our previous time, McNamara and Dunlavey and Thompson. That was very much the idea of the time, was for missionaries who went to new areas to establish churches and schools. In fact, there were a lot of schools that were established among us in the churches of Christ. Some of us, if we know the history of our other Christian colleges and institutions, know that you end up at Cordell and you end up at Harper, Kansas, and you end up at Morrilton, Arkansas, before you eventually get to Searcy, or you end up at Bartlesville before you eventually get to Edmond or Oklahoma City. And so that was a part of the history of the establishment and the practice of the churches in those times. I hope we're not still having trouble with our advancing. As he had spent time there, and he was at Cane Ridge for about 3 years, the time of his licensing was up, and he needed to seek ordination. And so he did that, and he was ordained a Presbyterian minister. This is a part of that story that's very well known about where we stopped last week in the previous session. He was asked as a part of that about his agreement with the Westminster Creed or Confession. And his response was, insofar as I see it consistent with the Word of God. That's a picture of the original structure at Cane Ridge. It's a very, very interesting structure. It has virtually no windows. It has little gun turrets that you can stick rifles through to fight off the Indians. You can just barely see out them. It has a balcony accessible only by ladders, which was for the slaves of the time. It has a very interesting pulpit, a reconstruction of the original. Quite an interesting experience to take students there from Ohio College, from Ohio Valley College, and to have them preach in that pulpit, or to preach in the pulpit at Bethany. It's a very, very interesting experience. I remember the first trip that I made to Cane Ridge. I was going to Lexington to hear a workshop being presented by Elmer Towns. And there was some time after the workshop concluded on an afternoon before I had to get to the airport and work out all of those details and begin the travel home. Decided to drive the 30 minutes out there. It was about an April afternoon, very still. And when I got there, there was no one else there. Just so interesting. And your mind could go back. You know, sometimes when you experience, for me it's especially the weather, when you experience an afternoon and it just seems that the climate and the sun and the wind and the smell of the air and all of that's just like it was whenever you were a kid. And you could just remember a time past. And so what I thought about, tried to think about, as I looked northward there from the church building, I thought, what would it be like to have 20,000 people, you know, just almost as far as you can see in that field out there, because it's still very, very rural. And so just trying to think, what would that be like? Across those cornfields there and all of that, trying to think what it would be like to have been a part of that revival, which of course occurred in August. There's another picture of the building. Well, Stone was at Cane Ridge those years, and after that, he went to the Carolinas in order to raise money for Transylvania College. And the story that is a part of his biography is the revulsion he felt as he visited back in the eastern part of the United States in those years at the slave auctions. He found it a very revolting thing. He wrote about it extensively. He could not imagine such inhumanity to other people. I think Stone was a very tender heart. I think he was maybe not a mental giant. Campbell eventually takes over that part of it. But Stone was a very, very tender heart and desirous of doing what God wished him to do. But he went back to Kentucky with a man named B.F. Hall. B.F. Hall had received a letter inviting him to go to Logan County, Kentucky, for a revival with James McGready. McGready was beginning to preach revivals as a part of this Second Great Awakening. Now, in 1800, according to the census information we have, and I'm not certain how dependable it would be, perhaps only estimates, but it said that Kentucky had about 250,000 people, about 250,000 people. The estimates are that 20,000 to 30,000 attended the Cane Ridge Revival, which we're going to get to in a moment. That'd be 10% of the population. I mean, you just think about it. I mean, just comparing it. If you have 3 million people in a state, more or less, slightly more, 10% is 300,000. That's a bunch of folks to get together in one place. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like. And by all of the reports that came out of the time, there were a lot of people who, as they said it, got religion. Well, they went to Kentucky, and they went to this camp meeting that was being held in Logan County with McGready, and they saw all of these strange things going on. But it reminded them of a lot of what they'd seen in the First Great Awakening, with the preaching of Whitefield and with the preaching of Edwards and other of the revivalists in the First Great Awakening about 75 years earlier. And so in that sense, well, they were encouraged. This is a line drawing of how that worked. They would just kind of set up artificial structure that could serve as a pulpit, and you can see they're probably, 12 feet up in the air, standing on a plank of some kind, and 3 or 4 preachers at a time. So kind of a state of confusion, perhaps, but just multitudes of people who would hear the gospel or the message or the Bible study being preached. Well, Cane Ridge had a protracted meeting set for August of that year, and so the word got out as a result of Logan County. Now we're up in Bourbon County, but more than 20,000 people, maybe as high as 30,000, of all kinds of religious beliefs and groups, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and among others as well, but these primarily, because it was a revival, and that's where revival was taking hold. That was where the idea was taking hold. And there are all more of these agitations and more of these various ideas of being struck down and of being touched in some way. And some of those, they say, were infidels. So some of the ones who were being converted were not previously Christians at all. People had come then, and Stone believed that it was the work of God. In 1830, which would be 30 years later, in the Christian Messenger, he wrote about the Cane Ridge Revival, and he admitted that there were excesses, but he said, "We preached the gospel as God's revelation, and we can believe it." For Stone at that time, basically the terms of accepting the gospel were to hear and to believe. But the whole point is that revivalism was casting doubt on Calvinistic election. Well, after that Cane Ridge revival, and as the church in Cane Ridge continued to grow and to prosper, a synod was being formed in Lexington. And the problem was that the leadership, the general leadership of the Presbyterian Church did not agree with liberal Presbyterian thought, and especially as it was being developed at Cane Ridge. So the Cane Ridge group continued to grow. They applied to the Washington Presbytery. They were accepted, but that caused the folks over at the Transylvania Presbytery to raise questions as to whether they ought to be let in. See, I told you one of the questions that we have is, what are the limits of fellowship and who's going to decide? So how much in agreement do we have to be? They're still Presbyterians, and they're still worshiping as Presbyterians. That's how they identify themselves. But they have a doctrinal difference. They're not quite as Calvinistic. They're not totally in rejection of Calvinism. As I said in McGreedy's preaching, it's the sovereignty of God plus human response. But here's the difference. And so here's what's going on. Well, the Cane Ridge group was added. The questions were raised, and it was going to come before the Kentucky Synod in 1803. Stone and his friends could see where that was going. So they withdrew. They said, we're not going to let you kick us out. We're going to decide to withdraw. The Synod met anyway and kicked them out, even though they had already withdrawn. Any recollections about questions of church fellowship that we have gone through? Can you withdraw from someone who says, you can't do that, I've already withdrawn? Well, that's not a new question. That question's over 200 years old. So the Kentucky Synod met anyway and kicked them out, but Stone and his friends formed a new presbytery, which was called the Springfield Presbytery. They formed that in 1803. And there were a number of congregations that immediately joined the Springfield Presbytery. And they had some conferences, and they thought they would be an evangelistic tool. But, and they did reach out evangelistically, but they never did settle much doctrinally. What happened in the Springfield Presbytery was there were a lot of people. This was consistent with the times. There were a lot of people who were opposed to division and were happy to be united upon the basics upon which they could agree. And so that was kind of the formation of the Springfield Presbytery. But before long, they realized that they didn't have any Bible authority to have a presbytery, to have that kind of organization. And so a document that you probably have heard about, the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, came to be a part of the history of the Restoration, and basically says that the Bible is complete. It is an authority. It is a sufficient guide. It can be depended upon, and if we have problems with division, it's because people have inserted their own ideas. And so that is from men and not from God, that division. And so if we're going to unite, we have to go back to the Bible. And we have to cast out all of these things that have come up with titles and ordinations and the kinds of things that Stone had gone through, and man-made church governments, and even class distinctions within the body are mentioned in the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. Because Stone was very, very adamant concerning the equal treatment of all people in these things. So how does the story then continue to play out as we move on down in this? Well, let me tell you one part of that to help you understand how, after 1804 and going forward, maybe even as a part of this last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, let me tell you how other people were developing concepts religiously. There was a Methodist circuit rider from Virginia named Rice Haggard. He had spent time with James O'Kelly, but he had read a book, a tract that was written by Samuel Davies, who was at Princeton. And Davies was not original. He had read a sermon preached by an Anglican named Grosvenor from 1728, about 60 to 70 years previous. And it was about the name Christian, and that we ought to wear only the name Christian. This was from an Anglican preacher. Well, Davies at Princeton read that sermon, and he developed his own version of that sermon and put it in print as a little tract. Now he died in 1761. So you have Grosvenor, and then you have Davies, and Rice Haggard read Davies' sermon, and he liked it. So he adapted his own sermon, and he began to preach that sermon. And church history tells us that it was Rice Haggard that suggested the name Christian to James O'Kelly among the Methodists in 1793. There were people in New England in the Christian Connection also using the name Christian. People would say, I'm of the Christian Connection only. By the 1830s, there were maybe 900 Christian Connection preachers, but they were mostly in New England. They never could decide whether baptism was compulsory. They had the idea that here's the truth, but you don't have to obey it. And it largely fell apart as a result of that. Well, Rice Haggard visited Kentucky in 1804, in March. And while he was there, he spoke with Barton Stone, and they studied together. And Stone, who had formerly been an independent Presbyterian, that's what he called himself, he adopted the name Christian. And so that's the story that I'm telling here as we think about these various converging interests. But let me talk about Barton Stone and baptism. One of the friends, other preachers that was involved with Stone at the time was a man named Marshall. And he had a written discussion with a Baptist who had formerly been a Presbyterian. And Stone was concerned that Marshall would become a Baptist and would wear that name. So Stone began to study biblical baptism in 1804 and onward. 3 years later, in a Stony Creek meeting, there was a woman who requested immersion, and Barton Stone baptized her, and several others were also baptized, including some preachers. Eventually, Stone was baptized, but he at first did not see the design of baptism. In fact, in the autobiography of Samuel Rogers, he says in 1822, Stone did not know what to demand in order that a person might obey the gospel. But he saw it after he read the Campbell-McCullough debate in 1823. But Stone ended up kind of out of the limelight or out of the spotlight because in 1810 his wife died. He married a widow, moved to Tennessee, farmed a property he had and also his mother-in-law's property, moved back to Kentucky in 1816, but always served as a school teacher and a preacher, established numerous small congregations, eventually was to Georgetown in 1829, eventually to Illinois. And so Stone's understanding of baptism was slow to develop. I'm sorry for the struggle here. We may... The story then, I want to come down and talk about the process by which the two groups come to join forces. Of course, they came to know one another. Those who were dealing with Campbell and the success of the Campbell movement through the years and through the 1820s, the Christian Baptist, eventually the Millennial Harbinger, The Christian Messenger being published by Stone. And so Stone and John T. Johnson were at this meeting in December of 1832. Raccoon John Smith and Samuel Rogers were there representing the Campbell element. According to history, Campbell was, quote, unable to attend, end quote. There's doubt about that. But the union was made without the consent of Alexander Campbell. He was not happy about it. He did not think it was a good idea. He thought there were too many differences, thought there were too many difficulties. But he really basically, because of those who were a part of the Campbell side of the effort, was pretty well forced into it. But some of the challenges are obvious in the immediate history thereafter. They did not see the Bible alike, Stone and Campbell, in many, many ways. For one, it was more mental. For the other, it was more practical. Stone was focused on piety very, very much, thinking about what we would call apocalyptic issues, end-of-world issues. He loved to establish Antioch churches of Christ. He was enamored by Antioch because that's where the Jews and the Gentiles got together. He was very much into this idea that everyone ought to be together, regardless of their race, regardless of their past religion, regardless of some differences that they might experience. He loved to preach about Jesus Christ as the hallowed Son of God, perfected and now leader of our salvation. His theme was again and again and again focused on Jesus Christ. I would say it's possible that in the last 20, 30 years, we have, as a group generally of churches of Christ in the United States, moved more toward Stone's message and away from Campbell's focus on these particular elements and enumerating them and those kinds of things. Well, in 1833, they decided to publish a joint hymn book. The editors were going to be Alexander Campbell, Walter Scott, Barton W. Stone, and D.P. Henderson. And there was a division over the name of the book. And so when the book was being put together and there were questions raised about the name of the book, Stone sent one of his former students, L.J. Fleming, to Bethany to check with Alexander Campbell as to why he so much liked the name Disciples, Disciples of Christ. After the fact, in the Millennial Harbinger, about 6 years later, when he advocates the use of the proper name, he says that proper name is Disciples of Christ. And he chooses that because that's the name that's 97 times in the Gospels, 3 times in the New Testament, the name Christian. Of course, the idea of Christian, that had come from a long history of Anglicans and Presbyterians and Rice Haggard and James O'Kelly among the Methodists, and then eventually to Stone.
Something I noticed when the discipling ministries were really trying to monopolize that term, so to speak, was that the term disciple only appears up through the book of Acts. After that,
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting as you try to study disciple and Christian in the New Testament, but that was Campbell's argument at the time. Well, Stone was hurt about the decision to use the name Disciples in the songbook, and he wrote Campbell, and there were others also who were frustrated at the time. Walter Scott was upset with Campbell, and if you trace the history and you think about churches of Christ and eventually the Civil War, the Christian churches, there was in Kentucky a serious doubt, perhaps even some resentment concerning Campbell for that particular thing. So we conclude this evening with a couple of more pictures of Cane Ridge. This is a picture I took on another trip. There was no one there the first time I was there, but this was the curator. There's a small cemetery there, and of course Barton Stone is buried there. And his tombstone is interesting, and because on his tombstone the saying is simply that he takes the Bible and Jesus Christ as his polar north star. And that is a tremendous statement. Thank you much for working with us through the video. Thank you for being patient with that. Thank you, Jeff. And we're going to have a few minutes now for questions or comments or other things.